on this first observation that says that we have to provide the causal link. And we completely agree, and we do exactly that with our first observation that talks about how these Latin American countries don't necessarily want to have these prohibitionist policies, but they are forced to because of pressure from the United States, because they don't want to disagree with the U.S., because there's a huge power in the region. But moreover, the Huffington Post explains that Latin American countries do want to overturn prohibition, but they can't because of the United States pressure. So with that in mind, let's move on to their first and only contention, which talks about the benefits of our anti-drug policy, namely subpoint A, which talks about excise taxes. And to this we have three key responses. The first of which is that this is domestic policy and is in no way related to anti-Latin America drug policy. You can't look at this in the round as well as their other impacts of this contention, because insofar as these excise taxes are passed by the U.S. for the purpose of decreasing the amount of smoking in the area. Moreover, the problem is that the drugs in the United States are bought through a black market. They aren't bought in stores. So we're not going to see any of these drugs actually see a price reduction. In fact, according to the New York Times, prices have decreased 74% over the past 30 years, which shows that our drug policy really isn't reducing the access to the amount of drugs in the United States. If anything, there are more people who have access to drugs. Now this is true because of the fact that these excise taxes are only applicable in legal places, in stores. They aren't applicable on the black market deals, and these black market deals are how these drugs are sold. But moreover, this is not current policy, because their own evidence that they provided us as of Friday says it's a budget proposal. It's not a current policy. We can't look to this going forward into the future. But next, let's move on to their subpoint B, where they talk about the anti-tobacco treaties that the United States has signed. But remember, first of all, this is again not policy against Latin America. This is domestic policy. Our opponents keep trying to tell you that domestic policy is what we have to look to in today's round, but it's not what we're looking to. We're looking to the impacts of our domestic policy on Latin America, and impact specifically due to our foreign policy. And our opponents are simply not showing that. But then they go and show that smoking has decreased by 20%. But smoking is very different from having drugs. Remember that they're saying that smoking is decreased, but not tobacco smoking. There's a really big distinction because they're talking about legal cigarettes going down and not the illegal drug trade that we should be trying to prevent. But moreover, they talk about how more people die of tobacco smoking than through violence in Mexico. But at the point where we're looking on a grand scale, we see that violence has increased 63% throughout all of Latin America. So when we're looking at all of Latin America, rather than just the one isolated example of Mexico, we should prefer violence stats in today's round because it has a larger impact, because we're seeing more violence, and because it's more holistic than just looking at Mexico. But next, our opponents provide you this subpoint C that talks about the counterfeit drugs. And to this we also have a few responses. The first of which is to their claim that we've seized more drugs and that's a good thing. But the problem is that the fact that we've seized more drugs only shows that our efforts to stop production in Colombia and in Mexico have failed completely. Because the fact that we're seizing more drugs means that more drugs are being produced in the first place. But the second response comes from Francis, who's a PhD at Temple University, who explains that clamping down with these efforts just means that they're going to go through other routes. They're going to take land routes instead of the sea routes that they previously were taking. And this is going to be worse in terms of violence because it's going through land routes. You can't start these battles that are taking civilian lives on the high seas. It's much easier to create civilian casualties when they're traveling through land routes, which is why we see violence increasing, which is why we see higher death tolls when they're taking these land routes. But the third response is that it comes from the Drug Policy Alliance, who explains that interdiction causes dealers to make more concentrated and deadlier drugs that are harder to detect, and cause more addiction and more deaths. So these people see that these drugs are being seized, so they make more compact drugs, more deadly drugs, so even if fewer of it gets through, the effect is still going to be the same. They're going to be more potent, they're going to be more deadly, and they're going to cause even more deaths than the drugs that would have been created before. We're creating natural selection throughout these drug dealers, and we're making them create more effective drugs. So for these